The ocean was too calm for men who had lost everything. When the ship carrying Japanese prisoners of war reached San Francisco Bay in late 1945, silence hung over the deck like fog. The men sat shoulder to shoulder, uniforms stiff with salt, faces hollow from months of defeat and humiliation. Ahead of them, the skyline shimmered, clean, untouched by war. It looked unreal, as if peace itself mocked them. They had been told what awaited them: torture, starvation, experiments. Propaganda back home had painted America as a land of cruelty, where captured soldiers were dissected for sport or worked until death. "They'll strip our skin and study it," one whispered. Another, older, replied, "Better to drown before they touch you." But no one moved. Even death felt like a privilege. When the ship's horn sounded, no one flinched. The gangplank lowered, and the first thing that reached them wasn't the sight of rifles but the smell of bread. Fresh, sweet, impossible. American soldiers were waiting on the dock, young, sunburned, their helmets too large. One of them, freckles across his nose, held out a canteen. "Welcome to America," he said softly. The words carried no hatred, only exhaustion. The prisoners froze. One reached for the canteen, hesitated, then drew back his hand. "Poison," someone muttered. But the young soldier just frowned, confused, and moved on. At the dock's edge, they were counted, tagged, and loaded into trucks. Inside the covered beds, the prisoners sat in rigid silence. "They treat us gently," one murmured, "so they can break us slowly, later." Hours later, the convoy stopped. No barbed wire, no barking dogs, only desert and endless sky. Neat rows of wooden barracks stretched across the plain. A faded sign read, "Camp Florence, Arizona." The camp was not what they imagined. No cages, no mud, just sunlight, fences, and order. "America builds prisons with light," one man muttered bitterly. An American officer greeted them through a translator. His voice was calm, his uniform spotless. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, eat, and rest. No harm will come to you." The words meant nothing. In their minds, prisoner still meant doomed. That night, as the desert cooled and the stars spread across the sky, they received their first meal: beans, cornbread, and coffee. Real coffee, the bitter, earthy kind they'd only smelled in officers' quarters. No one touched it. The aroma felt dangerous, but hunger won. One young soldier lifted his spoon with trembling hands. The warmth hit his tongue, sharp and foreign. It didn't taste like defeat. It tasted like life. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He turned away, ashamed. In the darkness, a voice whispered, "If this is how they kill us, it's strangely kind." The guards walked past, boots crunching in gravel. For them, it was routine. Prisoners fed, lights out. For the men behind the wire, it was something else entirely: confusion. How could mercy exist in the hands of an enemy? Before dawn, an older prisoner, a teacher before the war, sat awake, staring at the wooden beams above. He thought of Tokyo burning, of his emperor's trembling voice announcing surrender, of his students, now buried under ruins. And now, here, in this foreign desert, strangers offered him bread and coffee. He took the small tin cup beside his bunk, still half full, and wrote a single line in his notebook before sleep finally came. "The world I was taught to hate just gave me water." Morning came without fanfare. No shouting, no whips, no dogs. Just the clang of a distant bell and the smell of dust rising from the desert floor. The Japanese prisoners opened their eyes to a silence so complete It felt unreal. For the first time in years, no bombs, no sirens, no orders screamed through loudspeakers. Only the dry wind of Arizona brushing against the barracks. They were called outside for roll call. The sun had barely climbed over the horizon, and already the air shimmered with heat. American guards stood at ease, rifles slung casually, chatting among themselves. It was not the posture of conquerors, more like farmhands watching over tired guests. "Line up, please," the translator called in accented Japanese. "Face forward. Count when your number is called." The men obeyed automatically, expecting violence for the smallest mistake. But when one stumbled, the guard beside him caught his elbow instead of striking. The gesture, simple and wordless, carried more shock than any blow. After roll call, they were given breakfast, white bread, scrambled eggs, coffee, the kind of meal even officers in Japan rarely saw by the end of the war. Some stared at it, unsure if they were being mocked. Others ate in silence, their eyes flicking toward the guards as if waiting for the cruelty to begin. But it never came. The Americans spoke little, but their tone was almost polite. "Eat up," one said, tapping a metal tray. "You'll need it. Work starts soon." Work. The word carried dread. Back home, work camp had meant slow death. But this was different. They were marched out under the blazing sky to the edge of the camp, where farmland waited. There were shovels, plows, and irrigation pipes, tools, not chains. A sergeant demonstrated how to dig trenches for water lines. He spoke through the translator, patient, direct, almost like a teacher. "This water feeds the crops," he said. "Crops feed people. You do good work, we all eat." For men who had been told Americans were savages, it was disorienting. They expected guards to bark, not explain. The work was hard, backbreaking under the desert sun, but honest. When blisters formed, an American medic came with ointment. When someone collapsed from the heat, the guards gave water, not punishment. By noon, the men were too exhausted to speak. They sat in the thin shade of the trucks, their shirts dark with sweat, their minds spinning. One whispered, "They treat us like workers." Another replied quietly, "Maybe they see us as men." At dusk, the prisoners were marched back to camp. The barracks smelled of soap and sawdust. Dinner awaited: beans, rice, a slice of apple pie. The pie was a mystery in itself. "Why waste sugar on us?" one asked aloud. The translator shrugged. "Because it's dinner." That night, as the camp lights dimmed, the men lay awake in their bunks. They had survived the first full day in America. No beatings, no hunger, no humiliation. Just order, predictability. And yet, that frightened them more than cruelty. For years they had been told America was chaos, a nation of selfish men without honor. But here, everything ran like clockwork. The guards joked with each other. The meals came on time. Even the punishment system was written down, a book of rules translated into Japanese. One prisoner, formerly an officer, read it carefully by the weak light of a lamp. "Any soldier who mistreats a prisoner will be disciplined," he read aloud, his voice trembling. "Disciplined? For hurting us?" The others stared at him as if he'd spoken nonsense. It was the first time any of them realized something terrifying, that America wasn't trying to destroy them. It was trying to prove a point. That night, the wind howled through the desert, shaking the barracks. One man wrote in his diary, "I thought captivity meant losing one's soul, but maybe it means finding what it means to be human again." As the lights flickered out, the men fell asleep not to fear, but to the faint, unfamiliar feeling of safety. By the second week, the camp no longer felt like a trap, just a place without an exit. The fences still stood, tall and sharp, but behind them, life had begun to find rhythm. Morning roll calls, work details, meal times, lights out. The sameness became its own strange comfort. Then something happened that no one expected. The Americans showed mercy. It began with a cut. A young Japanese soldier named Taro slipped while carrying a crate of tools and tore open his palm. He hid it at first, wrapping it in his sleeve. In the Imperial Army, wounds were shame. Weakness was disgrace. But the blood wouldn't stop. An American guard spotted it and ordered him to the infirmary. Taro froze. "Punishment?" he whispered to the man beside him. The guard just gestured toward the small wooden building marked with a red cross. Inside, the air smelled of alcohol and soap. A medic, barely 20, looked up from his papers. "Sit," he said gently, pointing to a stool. The translator stood nearby, explaining each word. Taro hesitated. "He will fix me?" "Yes," the translator replied. "That's his job." When the needle pierced his skin, Taro flinched. The medic smiled slightly. "Don't worry. You'll live." Taro didn't understand the words, but he caught the tone, soft, almost kind. Afterward, the medic handed him a piece of candy, small, round, wrapped in red paper. "For you," he said. Taro stared at it as if it were a weapon. He took it, bowed awkwardly, and left without speaking. That night, he placed the candy on his bunk. He didn't eat it. He couldn't. It felt too foreign, too gentle, too wrong. The next morning, others noticed the bandage on his hand, clean, white, neatly wrapped. "Did they hurt you?" one asked. Taro shook his head slowly. "They healed me." No one believed him, but the truth spread anyway, whispered between bunks like a rumor of peace. Days later, another kindness came. The right to write home. The camp commander, Captain Miles, announced it through the translator. "Each of you may send one letter a month. The Red Cross will deliver them. Write honestly, but no military secrets." The room went silent. The idea that they could write to their families, that their words could cross an ocean, was almost unbearable. Some wept openly, covering their faces. Others stared blankly, too stunned to move. Paper and pencils were handed out. The men sat at long wooden tables, hands trembling, unsure what to say. What could you write after a war like that? Taro wrote only one sentence. "I am alive, and the people who captured me have not killed me." When he finished, he folded the page with shaking fingers, as if touching something sacred. That night, the mood in the barracks changed. Laughter, faint, hesitant, broke the silence for the first time. Someone began to hum an old Japanese folk tune, and no one stopped him. Even the guards passing outside didn't interrupt. The next morning, the prisoners returned to work in the fields. The sun was merciless, the soil dry and stubborn. But something inside them had shifted. The Americans still watched from the edge, but now the prisoners saw them differently. Not as tormentors, but as men doing a job. At noon, one guard, a tall Texan named Harris, noticed a group of prisoners struggling to lift a heavy crate. Without thinking, he dropped his rifle, walked over, and lifted one side himself. "Here," he grunted. The prisoners froze, unsure if this was a trick. But when the crate was set down, Harris simply nodded and said, "Good work." The translator later told them what the words meant. Good work. Two simple words, but they landed like thunder. That evening, Taro finally unwrapped the candy from his pocket. It had melted slightly in the desert heat, sticky and sweet. He placed it on his tongue and closed his eyes. "It tastes like peace," he whispered. And for the first time since surrender, he believed peace might be real. It started on a quiet afternoon when the Red Cross truck rolled through the camp gates, kicking up a cloud of dust. The prisoners didn't pay much attention at first. Trucks came and went, food supplies, tools, guards. Nothing ever changed. But this time, something was different. The driver wasn't a soldier. He wore a white armband marked with a red cross. In the back of the truck, a crate of envelopes. The translator climbed onto a bench and called out in English first, then Japanese. "Mail has arrived. Letters from home." For a moment, no one moved. Then, as if the words had broken a spell, the entire camp fell into stunned silence. "Letters?" someone whispered. "From Japan?" The guards began calling names from a list. One by one, men stepped forward, hesitant, trembling, afraid it was some cruel joke. The first letter went to an old sergeant named Nakamura. His hands shook as he reached out, touching the thin paper as if it might vanish. He pressed it to his forehead before even opening it. Others followed. Some found their names. Some didn't. When a name wasn't called, the man would step back, eyes hollow, as if he'd been erased from the world itself. The lucky ones opened their envelopes right there in the dust. Words from wives, mothers, sisters, cramped handwriting, smudged ink, sentences written by candlelight across an ocean. "We heard you are alive. The house still stands, though the roof is gone. Your daughter was born in April. She has your eyes." Some men read silently. Others broke down. Tears fell onto the paper, staining the ink. Taro, the soldier, who once feared a doctor's kindness, received nothing. He stood among the crowd, silent. Then a guard approached with a small envelope that had slipped to the bottom of the crate. "Taro Sato?" the guard asked. Taro stepped forward, heart pounding. The letter was short, written by his mother. "The war has taken everything, but not my prayers. If you're reading this, you are alive. That is enough." He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully, like a sacred thing. That night, the barracks glowed with weak yellow light as men wrote their replies. They had only one sheet of paper, one envelope, and one chance to speak across the void. Some wrote confessions, some wrote lies, that they were well fed and strong, that they missed home but were treated fairly. But most simply wrote the truth. "I am still human." The next morning, the letters were collected in a wooden box marked "Outgoing." The translator sealed it with string and handed it to the Red Cross officer. For many, it felt like breathing again after months underwater. Days passed. The camp grew quieter, not from fear, but reflection. The guards noticed it too. One evening, Captain Miles walked past the barracks and heard faint singing, a slow, sad melody in Japanese. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't stop it. He simply stood there, listening. Inside, the prisoners sang of home, of mountains, of sea, of rain falling on temple roofs. The song drifted through the fences, across the fields, into the night. When it ended, no one spoke for a long time. Then Taro said softly, "Maybe mercy is also a kind of weapon. It makes you remember who you were before the war." That line spread through the camp like wildfire. Even the guards repeated it quietly. By the end of that week, the Americans allowed small freedoms, reading books, tending gardens, even drawing. Life didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like waiting, waiting to return, but not to the same world they'd left. In their hearts, something irreversible had begun. For the first time, they weren't just surviving in America. They were learning from it. By December, the desert had grown cold. The wind that once scorched now cut like a knife, slipping through the cracks of the barracks. The prisoners worked slower, talked less, and waited for the year to end, though none of them believed endings brought peace anymore. Then, one morning, a rumor spread. The Americans are decorating the mess hall. No one believed it. Decorations were for celebrations, and celebrations were for the free. But when they marched to breakfast, the truth stood in front of them, simple, bright, almost absurd. Strings of paper cutouts hung from the ceiling. A small pine branch stood on a table, bent and awkward, wrapped in tinfoil, and above the serving counter someone had painted in clumsy letters, "Merry Christmas, Peace to All." The prisoners stopped in the doorway. The guards shuffled, embarrassed, unsure if they had gone too far. Captain Miles stepped forward. "This morning," he said through the translator, "there is no work. Today, everyone eats together." The room went silent. Even the translator hesitated before repeating it. "Eat together?" Long wooden tables were lined with trays of food, bread, stew, potatoes, even slices of pie. The smell alone was overwhelming. Some prisoners crossed their arms, suspicious. Others whispered prayers. Then one man, old Nakamura, took a seat. He folded his hands, bowed his head slightly, and whispered in Japanese, "If they offer peace, we must accept it." The others followed, slowly, one by one. For the first time, Americans and Japanese sat side by side. The meal began awkwardly, the sound of spoons scraping metal plates, the nervous laughter of guards. Then, someone on the American side pulled out a harmonica. The tune was soft, hesitant, Silent Night. A few of the prisoners recognized it. One of them, a fisherman from Nagasaki, began humming the melody in Japanese. Another joined, then another. By the second verse, voices filled the hall, two languages, one song. The guards didn't stop them. No one could. When the music ended, silence lingered, heavy and fragile. A sergeant on the American side, the same Texan who once lifted the crate, raised his coffee mug. "To the men who survived," he said quietly. The translator repeated his words. Taro, seated at the far end of the table, lifted his own tin cup and echoed, "To the men who remember." It was not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. That evening, as the sun bled across the desert, small lights flickered through the camp. Some guards lit candles. The prisoners, forbidden to have matches, used the reflection of the moon on tin cups to catch the last rays of dusk. They placed them on windowsills, creating tiny points of light in the darkness. A guard passing by stopped and asked the translator, "What are they doing?" "Lanterns," the translator said, "for the dead." No one ordered them to stop. Later that night, Taro sat outside his barrack, the desert air sharp and still. He pulled from his pocket the letter from his mother, folded and refolded 100 times, and read it again by candlelight. "If you're reading this, you are alive. That is enough." He smiled faintly, whispering, "It's more than enough." The camp was silent except for the faint echo of laughter from the mess hall. Somewhere, a guard played the harmonica again, the same slow song carried by the wind. In that moment, the war felt distant, not gone, but fading, like a memory too tired to keep its shape. By the summer of 1946, the camp felt almost empty. The fences were still there, the guard tower still stood, but the noise was gone. No more roll calls, no more orders shouted in English across the yard. Just wind, dry grass, and the creak of wooden doors left half open. The war had been over for a year. The men were no longer prisoners, only detainees awaiting transport. But the word didn't matter. Every sunrise they looked east, toward the ocean, toward home. When the day finally came, it arrived without ceremony. A truck rolled into camp, carrying uniforms and papers stamped repatriation. The guards gathered the remaining men in the yard. Captain Miles stepped forward, his voice low. "You're going home," he said. "The war's done. You'll see your families again." Taro stood among them, thinner than when he arrived, but with eyes that no longer carried fear. He still had the letter from his mother, folded so many times it had turned soft like cloth. As the men boarded the trucks, the Americans handed out small brown packages, soap, chocolate, cigarettes, postcards. From the Red Cross, they said, though everyone knew who had packed them. When Taro opened his, a bar of soap fell into his hand, white, clean, perfumed, the same kind they had used that first day in the showers. He smiled faintly. "So it ends as it began," he murmured. At the docks, the men lined up to board the ship that would carry them across the Pacific. Some of the guards saluted. Others just watched in silence. Captain Miles shook Taro's hand. "You fought well," he said, "but you lived better." Taro didn't understand the words, but he felt the weight behind them. He bowed deeply. As the ship pulled away, the shoreline blurred into haze. For hours no one spoke. Then, as night fell, someone began to hum Silent Night. Another joined. Then another. The song that had once filled a Texas mess hall now drifted over an open sea. Weeks later, Japan appeared on the horizon, dark, broken, silent. Smoke still rose from the ruins of cities. The men stared in disbelief. Their homeland, the empire they had been taught to die for, looked nothing like the world they had left behind. When Taro stepped onto the dock at Yokosuka, no one greeted him. His village was gone, his house reduced to ashes. Only the letter in his pocket remained whole. He wandered for days before finding work helping rebuild rail lines. The pay was small, the days long, but the air smelled of rain and earth, and that was enough. One evening, he visited a market by the harbor. A merchant was selling American goods, soap, candy, cigarettes. Among them, he saw the same red-wrapped candy the medic had once given him. He bought one, unwrapped it carefully, and placed it on his tongue. The taste hadn't changed. "It still tastes like peace," he whispered. Years passed. The memory of the camp faded into the fog of history. To most, it was just another footnote in the long shadow of the war. But for the men who had lived it, those dusty barracks in Texas were not a prison. They were where they had learned that mercy could be stronger than fear. In 1956, a reunion was held in Tokyo. Former POWs gathered to share their stories. Some brought photographs. Others, small relics, a Red Cross letter, a tin cup, a folded flag. Taro came too, carrying only the bar of soap wrapped in paper. When it was his turn to speak, he said simply, "They taught us that strength was cruelty. America taught me that strength can be kindness." The room fell silent. Someone began to clap. Then everyone did. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like that winter night in Texas again. The sound of laughter, the taste of warm bread, the song of two nations that had once tried to destroy each other, now bound by the smallest act imaginable, the giving of water, of food, of mercy. As he left, Taro looked up at the stars. He thought of his mother's words. "If you are reading this, you're alive. That is enough." He smiled. It was more than enough.